So welcome to New Streams, Finding Faith Online. I'm Sherry Kling. I'm Director of Process and Faith, which is a program of the Center for Process Studies. And both the center and the program have been around for several decades. And so we're just really excited to be looking for interesting ways to have discussions about faith and about our ideas about how the cosmos works. We come from a process perspective, but we're open to lots of new friends and discussions. And I want to, before we get really rolling, introduce Jared Morningstar, who does communications with the Center for Process Studies. He's going to be giving us Zoom support this evening. And so anyway, with that, I think we should just dive right in. First, what I would like to do is introduce our panelists for the evening. I'm going to do this in alphabetical order. So first we have Matt Baker, and if you want to wave your hand while I'm introducing you. Matt Baker is the host of War Machine, which is a podcast for theological nomads at the intersection of radical theology, philosophy, and Western esotericism. Come on now, that's got to be good stuff. And he's done other work before. I won't linger on his full bio. You can see that at the event page, but just definitely check out his podcast. We also have with us Kate Eaton, who runs an organization called Mishka, and Kate creates beautiful worship experiences, both in person and online. Then we have Robert Nicastro, who is with the Center for Christogenesis at Villanova, where he produces the podcast Hunger for Wholeness, that's hosted by Ilia Delio, and has amazing guests all the time. And then we have Josh Patterson, who is with Rethinking Faith. He is the host of that podcast, is a former pastor turned professional brewer with a deep love for theology and philosophy. I also will mention Robert is a PhD candidate at Villanova in theology and religious studies. And let's see, finally, we have Janelle Apps Ramsey, who is the uh, co-director of a podcast called Brew Theology, which also I think still does some in-person events there in the Denver area. And Janelle is also an interfaith leader living there in Denver. And so she's involved in all kinds of community building and conversation. And I just had this idea to bring these folks together to talk about a phenomenon that has just become more and more popular these days about in this online sphere of finding faith, and of course especially, or exploring faith, or discussing theology or philosophy. Of course, the pandemic, I think, pushed a lot of people in the direction that they might not have been open to otherwise. And so here we now find ourselves in this environment. So we want to explore that a little bit and see where it's taking our hosts, our panelists, and where it's taking their audiences and what their observations have been. So with that, I guess we will just get started. I'm going to try to I'll go, I'm going to mix up the order maybe from question to question, but we'll just go through, have each panelist respond to a prompt and share some thoughts. So the first question I have is, I would just like to ask each of you to just say a few words about what you do, and what the goals or the hopes of your work has been, and maybe a little bit about who you see as your audience. So let's see. Janelle, you want to start us off?
Sure can. So I am with Brew Theology, and we originally started as a in-person group in Denver. You could say that our target audience was probably a lot of post-evangelicals that were deconstructing and trying to give them a place to gather, because that's what Ryan and I were doing as well. And over time, we added the podcast to that. So in our earlier iterations, we really just took two or three people that gathered around the table on Thursday night, brought them around a mic maybe on Tuesday night, and just had the conversation again. So very much what we did live. And then we've kept doing that. And then when COVID hit, Ryan ended up moving away to Texas, and we still do this together. But now our podcast has shifted a little bit more towards interviews with different folks that we know and run into. And again, I would say kind of rebuilding faith is a big part of what underlies that. One of the big surprises as we continued to gather and still gather in our different cities, we are largely, our people are atheist and agnostic. So we do have a lot of post-evangelicals, but we have attracted people from all kinds of backgrounds, many of which aren't interested really at all in organized religion, but are interested in spiritual topics. So it's been a really awesome just evolution. And we're also intentionally interfaith, which is where I do some of my other work in Denver. So we try to have speakers from different traditions and try to make space to explore ideas from different religious traditions pretty regularly.
Thank you. That's awesome, Janelle. Thank you. How about Josh? You want to go next?
Yeah, sure. So again, I'm Josh Patterson. I host the Rethinking Faith podcast, excuse me. It was originally called Theology Doesn't Suck when it first started. And the whole premise, this was a little over 5.5 years ago, was I had a friend of mine, excuse me, who was a pastor, and I was still a pastor at the time, and we had very different theological perspectives. He was a Westminster Confession or bust kind of, Calvinist. The regular principles of worship is his best friend, and I was a budding open theist at the time, and we wanted to create a podcast to show that people from different theological camps could have meaningful conversation together, and it worked for a while until it didn't. They bailed on the project after calling me a heretic and a few other things. And the show has continued on. So really, it has been, uh, in a weird way, my own, it's kind of an excuse for me to talk to and interview the kind of people that are asking the fun questions that I'm interested in. I very much come from a process relational perspective, so that is kind of tinged throughout the show, but I talk to a wide variety of guests from different backgrounds, different faith traditions, maybe no faith tradition, these kind of things. Yeah, and I guess you said the audience. It's an interesting mix. There are plenty of ex-evangelicals or those who are deconstructing or who have deconstructed. Um, there are those who just like the nerdy process stuff, because sometimes I have nerd conversations with people who are way smarter than me that I try to keep up with, um, and see what happens. And yeah, so it's been a fun experience. I really am just trying to create a space for people who have been hurt by the church like I have, to ask meaningful questions with people across various traditions in a way that's safe but also challenging. So it's a little bit about what I do.
That's great. Thank you, Josh. Appreciate it. Okay, how about let's go to Robert.
Thank you, Sherry. As Sherry mentioned, I work with Elia Delio at her nonprofit organization called the Center for Christogenesis. And it's steeped in the theological thinking of the Jesuit paleontologist Teilhard de Chardin. Those of you who are Whiteheadians or have familiarity with the Center for Process Studies, as I'm assuming most of you do, probably at least have heard the name Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. And this podcast, Hunger for Wholeness, is rooted also in his thinking. And we named it and fashioned the concept, A Hunger for Wholeness, based on the notion that we are living in an interconnected cosmos where God, person, and world form three dimensions of one coming to be reality. But we also notice that within that theological and scientific milieu of interconnection between God, person, and world, many of us still live a fragmented existence. And so we wanted to have conversations that would enrich our perspectives beyond Sunday worship experiences. What do I mean? Well, we rooted this also in St. Paul's notion of faith comes not only through seeing, but through hearing. And there's something about a podcast that connects us together through our hearing in a very unique way that can enrich what's going on inside us very uniquely, what Paul Tillich and Teilhard and others called an ultimate concern, but also together through conversations gives that which is welling up inside us an echo, an expression that not unlike Josh shared, gives us a safe space in which to have those discourses. So as a result of that being the concept, my job has been to seek multiple voices within scientific communities, philosophical communities, spiritual and theological communities to bring us together and talk about in our independent discourses how we can unite in a common voice, how we all seek wholeness together. And our audience is very eclectic. As a result of the seeking of wholeness of the human community, we don't just cater to those who have always been on this God quest or this wholeness journey. We're trying to appeal to millennials who are recognizing a basic need for meaning in their life, but don't find it in ecclesiastical communities. And as a result of coming to this shared space, we're really trying to construct a new church of the planet that goes beyond borders and barriers and recognizes mind and heart as the deepest meaning of human existence. And within that expression, giving us a God big enough to believe in. At least we hope renewing the meaning of God in our time and believing in God a new way. So that's the essence of our podcast. And we've only been in existence for 2.5 years. And we hope that our numbers and audience continues to grow and hopefully continues to do more good. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Robert. Let's go to Matt.
Sure. Robert, there was something you said at the end there that I was struck by. I'm sort of paraphrasing because my short-term memory is fucked. But something to the effect of, mind and heart being the deepest meaning of human experience. I think that's a beautiful phrase. So I just want to say that. So yeah, thank you. So some of you may know there's this whole kind of para-academic industry complex that's online. Mainly it's people who, for one reason or another, were never taken down the dark path of academia, but who still have these very kind of nerdy and oftentimes existential interests, and that's kind of where I situate myself. And that eventually led me to podcasting. I've been a podcaster since 2016. When I joined the now defunct podcast that was called The Catacomic Machine. It was started by a Swedish guy named Joseph Gustafsson. At the time, it was my favorite theology podcast. And I remember being really excited, but also very nervous joining the show. Joseph invited me on to do some interviews, and then I began producing the show, and then eventually I feel like I started to find my own theological voice, I guess you could say. I've also produced a podcast for the Westar Institute with Jordan Miller that was called Interrupted. And for the last few years, I've had a podcast called War Machine, which is kind of a hat tip to the nomadology in the work of Gilles Deleuze. Yeah, I mean, I've said this elsewhere, but podcasting for me is a very selfish exercise. It gives me a place where I can, like Josh said, ask the kinds of questions that I want to ask, have the kinds of conversations I want to have with really interesting people who I wouldn't otherwise have any reason to be in contact with, really. And some of them now I consider friends. So it's been really great in that way. But I guess the goal for the podcast, or I don't know if it's so much of a goal or as much as a vision. I'm really hoping to create a kind of multivocal space, where different people, different contributors can come in, ask their own questions, and can kind of create a sense of community around that. Um, and that thing about online community, there was a time when I was very sort of cynical about that idea. But having been a part of online communities now for a while, I think I've come around a little bit on that. And I think there really are opportunities for meaningful connection, um, for collective exploration and growth and these kinds of things. So yeah, I'll just leave it there.
Thank you so much, Matt. That's great. Well, let's now go to Kate, and after Kate shares her thoughts, I'll be actually showing a video of one of the worship experiences that Kate created. So, but let's first go to your comments, Kate.
Mhm. Thank you so much. It's fascinating to hear everybody on this call. My background is in creating a new worship service for St. John's Cathedral in Denver, Colorado, called The Wilderness. This was 15 years ago, actually, now. And it is, curiously enough, at least as far as I know, one of the longest standing alternative worship services in the Episcopal Church. When we launched this, we thought it would be a pickup service for those who were hikers and skiers. We kind of thought, 20s and 30s, and it ended up being people from 6, 7, 8 years old on up into their 80s and 90s. And so we were all shocked and surprised, and needless to say, very excited. It became for me really a petri dish to try recreating, recasting traditional hymns, prayers, etc., with a world music sound. And what we discovered is that sort of frightening thought of alternative worships services, which sends every music director running for the hills, or putting in place every control mechanism that they know to keep any kind of hum and strum out of their great tradition of high Anglican sound. So I was pretty scared, but we just took our steps forward, and the director of music actually said, this is something that I could never have anticipated. It's not what I do, but it works. So from there, we began creating a walking meditation, which is called the Via Sacra, or Sacred Way. And this was to take people into the dusty, unencountered spots in this great cathedral, the bell tower, the little dusty staircases. And what we did is we'd create little stations, places where people could stop, kneel on a pillow, take a sprig of an herb, and just open the senses. So this then led me to start Mishka, which is reminiscent of the anointing stone in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, where the body of Jesus was taken down off the cross and laid. It's a traditional site. It's not an actual archaeological site, but pilgrims come there and they pour myrrh on the stone and bring little bits of fabric and trinkets and take all these home to their friends and family. And when I went there, I thought, I wonder if we could recreate this in our service. And so I took it to the priest, and of course he turned white. And I think his fear was that we were going to do some kind of kitschy, scary, tent-like structure that would just send people running for the hills. So we worked really hard, and what we ended up doing is creating this stop where people could come and take a little piece of fabric, dip it in the myrrh, and seal whatever experience they were having as they journeyed around the cathedral. We weren't sure if anybody would get out of their seats. They did, in droves. And so that all then opened the idea of, what else can we do? What other holy sites across the world could we create in this live worship space? So now, fast forward to the pandemic, I began to think, I wonder, can we create this sensory worship experience with a camera and play it for people? And what would that do? So we did it, and we couldn't believe it actually worked. People were still having this very impactful experience. And what I wanted to share is what I've heard consistently over the 15 years of doing this is that people will say to us, I had no idea I could feel this way in church. I had no idea that I wouldn't want to run for the hills if I heard any kind of preaching or scripture readings. And for those who are longtime Episcopalians, they said, I feel like this is a resource that I didn't know I needed and that I could use. So the online worship worked. And I would say my goals now are just to keep my ears and eyes open to see how I might be able to play a role in this whole notion of connectivity, and that people are lonely. Our Surgeon General has said we're in an epidemic of loneliness. So I'm just listening for how I might be able to be of service. So thank you.
Thank you, Kate. I'll just mention that I met Kate when I was working for the University of the South in Swanee, Tennessee, which is an Episcopal affiliated liberal arts college and school of theology. And we met at a conference, and then I invited Kate to come to Swanee and basically teach a workshop around this work she does and create this worship in a very traditional cathedral at Swanee. And so I've actually had the opportunity to experience it in person. And so, but now I just want to play pieces of a video from during the pandemic when Kate did an Advent worship series, and this is the third week of that series. And I'm going to jump around a little bit just to show you some highlights from this worship. And so let me share my screen so we can do that. Okay, so I'm going to play just a little bit of the beginning and then go to a section that shows, I think, how more of the sort of traditional elements of song and prayer are incorporated, and then move to another section to show that walking meditation that Kate talked about. So again, remember, this is something people are watching on their computers during the pandemic. And now I'm going to jump a little bit ahead.
Shines in the darkness, and the darkness has never put it out. God sent his messenger, a man named John, who came to tell people about the light, so that all should hear the message and believe.
Disturbing God, we thank you for the witness of John the Baptist. Help us to be open to the changing power of your love and to be true witnesses to the power of Jesus in our lives. Amen.
Jesus Christ is the light of the world.
A light no darkness can quench.
Stay with us, Lord, for the hour is late.
And the day is almost over.
Even the darkness is not dark to you.
And the night shines like the day.
Let your light scatter the darkness.
And fill your church with your glory.
Israel's strength and consolation, hope of all the earth thou art.
As much as I'd love to stay and hear that whole song, I'm going to move ahead now to the walking meditation part, just so you can see a little bit of that also. Okay. So I will put the link to that whole experience video in the chat. But Kate, you want to say maybe a couple words about, just before we go on to the next question, about that video, that video? Yeah, you want to just want to say add any thoughts about how, like you said, how that went then?
I think what surprised us was that the experience could actually translate to that, online experience. It's not for everybody, but certainly I think people who would normally be at a service and couldn't be really could settle and immerse themselves in those prompts, and that was really a surprise. So we went on and did 3 or 4 more seasons. We did a Lenten one, a one for Pentecost, and it wasn't an inexpensive endeavor because to get that video to be that strong, I suppose we needed to put out a certain amount of money for that. But we found that it was worth it. So thank you.
Thanks, Kate. I guess I'd like to circle back to the podcasters and just ask you, maybe in what ways in your because you're probably for the most part pre-recording, I'm guessing pre-recording conversations and then putting them out there versus having live streamed events, although maybe you do some of that too. So what has been your experience in terms of the feedback loop with the conversations and the podcasts? How have you experienced people's feedback? Other than, rating the podcast, like in what other ways have people reached back to you? Josh, do you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, sure. I will do my best to go first here. Good question. As far as feedback goes, I mean, I get both positive and negative feedback. Most of the time though, on the positive side of things, I get a lot of gratefulness from people for offering up, I guess a non-threatening space, right? uh, because for people who maybe walking into a church service is scary, or maybe even watching a church service online is still kind of scary. Listening to a podcast, um, is kind of less threatening, I guess, because if you don't like it, you just like, tell it to screw off and then you don't have to listen to it anymore. So it has, and I mean, I guess you could do the same with YouTube videos. But it seems like that's the kind of thing that I get from people is this kind of thank you for a non-threatening environment that I can opt into or opt out of. Also, I think I've gotten um, feedback from uh, clergy members who don't feel as if they have the kind of space to ask and raise the questions that they have in a way where they don't get fired, right? Because a lot of clergy people they have a mortgage and they have kids that are in college or whatever it is, and so the podcasting realm kind of is like, hey, I can listen to this in my car and no one's going to know kind of thing. So there's kind of a gratefulness for that. um yeah, I mean that's a lot of the kind of feedback, and then I always get negative feedback, right? People like to throw rocks at stuff.
Sure.
Mostly I find the two things that get me in the most trouble is when I bring on my friends that exist within the LGBTQ community. Whenever I have queer folks on my podcast, people tend to get upset, which is interesting to me because I say things like maybe God doesn't exist, and they're like, that's fine, just don't have gay people on your podcast, which blows my mind.
Yeah. Yeah.
um but yeah, that and critiquing the Christian nationalism isn't often well received, but
Mm.
outside of that, it tends to be pretty positive feedback. People appreciate the space and the vulnerability, the willingness to ask questions.
Yeah. Thank you. What about you, Matt? What have you seen in terms of the feedback loop?
Um,
Just in how it works too. Like, how do people reach out to you? How do you hear from them?
yeah. Okay. So, I mean, I will say, at the outset here that I don't have the audiences that, my colleagues here do. We're a very niche, sort of, affair. So I don't often get feedback, but occasionally I do. I've never received any negative feedback because I feel like the people who listen to something like our show, they just, like Josh said, they're moving on to something that's more interesting for them.
Mm-hmm.
And I I like that. I like that approach. Just keep it moving, you know? Um, but in terms of like the feedback loop, right? Like that makes me think of like a sort of a call and a response or something like this. There's a dialectic, right? Um, and I think I mentioned when I mentioned earlier that it's been a means for me to um kind of find my own theological voice, and I think that that's true, and it's for me it's a creative expression, it's a social outlet. But I think by the time someone stumbles upon our podcast, it's likely that they've already taken a few steps down the, I don't know, the path, quote unquote, path of deconstruction, and are probably by nature curious people. And the sense that I have is that for a lot of people, that kind of these are the things that I that people don't say explicitly, but the sense that I get is that kind of intellectual curiosity is one that often comes along with first of all, it's a common denominator, but it comes along with not just finding new ways of thinking about things, but is kind of inseparable from a sense of um, looking for new means of connection and spirituality um, in the wake of the what I would say the death of God, right, or the sort of implausibility of the omni God. Maybe it would be a more sort of kind of a way of saying it here, but Um, yeah, I think those kinds of moments of connection or spirituality that sort of bubble up or break through this sort of just normal kind of banter is something that I find really life-giving. And I think there's an orientation. I think there's people, the people that I come into contact with are oriented toward intellectual things and also mystery. And I think those two things really uh, mark the people that show an interest in our kind of thing.
Yeah, good. Thanks. And I just want to mention, I know we've been using the term deconstruction. I shouldn't assume that everyone listening here tonight knows what that is. So really, it's basically just a term that refers to the process that people often go to when they encounter ideas about religion, their tradition, or their faith that cause them to take apart the beliefs that they were raised with, or the traditional elements that they were raised with, and begin to question those and maybe look for some new articulations of their faith. So that's that's the term deconstruction refers to that process that people often go through. Let's see. How about Robert? Do you want to jump in on feedback conversations?
Sure. And thank you for all the comments that were made already. It's making me think that so much of this is really putting the mystery back into the God language. And I think that's very important indeed. A full disclosure on this question, I'm actually not on the end of the podcast business where I would receive
Uh-huh.
explicitly, but I have heard things over the past few years. And one of the consistent refrains seems to be, thank you for helping us learn. Thank you for helping us learn that we can't live without what we thought we could live without. And this goes back to one of Kate's comments about the idea that people really do long for deep connectivity and a will for communion, but that's not always expressed in a Sunday worship service, at least not in a classical Sunday worship service. When the pandemic hit us, we were immediately excised from those formal communities, and many people who were not fully satisfied with either the worship experience, the preaching experience, or both, quickly learned that this is what they could live without. But then when these opportunities of podcasts and online experiences that were leading us to new and deeper experiences of community emerged, they learned that, well, maybe these conversations and this new medium for spiritual renewal is something we can't live without, really. And so I consider that a new expression of Eucharist too, because Eucharist on its best day really pulls us into an ecclesial existence. Well, if we're now giving a new form for an ecclesial existence, we're now expanding what we mean by Eucharist and perhaps enriching it in more powerful ways. And I think this really is a moment, a timely moment for we as theologians and philosophers and persons who take an interest in these questions and matters to seize upon, because we could really, I think, lead us to new horizons, spiritual horizons. So all by way of saying, I haven't received much negative feedback. The feedback that I have just shared, I consider very positive, and I hope it continues to come, and no doubt will with these types of conversations we're having too, because I think people really like to hear how we're forming connections in and among our different groupings. So thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank you, Robert. And your background perfectly illustrates the idea of connections, doesn't it? So perfect. Um, let's see. I wanted to come back to Janelle because Janelle, you've done all three of in-person gatherings with Brew Theology. You've done live Zoom gatherings with Brew Theology, and then you've done pre-recorded conversation
Yeah.
podcasts. So talk a little bit about what you've observed within those three contexts.
Yeah. With the podcast, I'd say that Ryan probably gets more of the feedback online. That's kind of his realm.
Hmm.
But the funniest thing that happened to me was a few years after we started, I was at Wild Goose and I heard someone say, "I know that voice. You're Janelle." And that was like the weirdest thing that ever happened.
Yeah.
But it was really fun. And most of the time, in terms of the podcast, I'll have people come up at random times that are, that I work with here in Denver, and they're like, "I listened to that podcast and it was really great, and this is what I took from it." And so it's kind of that, how did this fit into my life and my existence? And that's really fun to hear. We
Hmm.
do help people start their own brew theology communities, and so often they'll come from the podcast and then ask to start a new community, and so we help set them up with that. We have
Hmm.
all the curriculum and all the instructions ready to go for
Oh,
them
very
to
good.
do that. So in terms of live on Zoom and in person. It's just amazing the different kinds of people that come and show up. We never know who might be visiting or what perspective they might bring. We even have a gentleman that's in a nursing home that started coming during COVID and comes every single week, even when
Wow.
he disagrees with our LGBTQ topics and other things like that. But he's there and he wants to have the conversation, and it's just been a kind of a blessing to see that this is connected with so many different people.
Mm.
Um, and the other thing that's been neat in COVID and since then is we've incorporated having people visit us on Zoom, whether we're all on Zoom or if we're live together, but they come in on Zoom and still have that
Hmm.
conversation. So it's
Hmm.
expanded who we can bring in and who we can have conversations with. And I really love that. So
Yeah.
um, we have only had to ask two people to leave a meeting in
Huh.
the 8 years we've done this. We
Wow.
have some ground rules, and people respect those, and that makes for an environment. They may not come back all the time, but we welcome everyone, and we try to hold that space where everyone's welcome to ask questions and work back and forth through an issue.
Yeah. That's great, Janelle. Thank you. And Kate, I just wanted to talk a little bit about because your work during the pandemic, my understanding was that you pre-recorded the whole worship experience, but then you streamed it on, Facebook or YouTube or both. And so while that it was streaming, you probably were there being able to see the feedback roll in the chat function. So talk a little bit about what that was like.
Well, surprising. I mean, I think the one of the pieces that maybe it shouldn't have been that surprising is we didn't have a lot of people live, on it with us.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, they were watching later. Like our views went quite high afterwards, and so I was like, oh my gosh. So it was really hard to capture, what were people thinking, but for the few that were on there live, there were a lot of like hearts and
Parts.
yes and all those things kind of floating up. So that gave us a little bit of a sense of how people were feeling about it. I think the main thing that this afforded us and those who watched was just that it could be done, because I think a lot of people said to me, wait, how are you going to do this? Because so much of what you do is it's about people touching, feeling. And I just said, you know what? We don't have a choice. We're going to just do this. And so most people thought I was crazy, and I just had to kind of walk through that. So it was neat to see that medium could actually hold, an interactive space like that.
Yeah.
And the camera guy just followed me around to each encounter. And I think it really was his expertise that allowed that to be an intimate
Yeah.
experience.
Yeah. That's great. Great. Well, before we turn it over to discussion with the attendees, I'd like to just ask one more question. And I guess you could, pick which one you want to answer, but I guess I might ask what has surprised you the most about the work? Or if you want to talk a little bit about maybe a specific topic or guest on your podcast that you had a conversation with that really opened up something new for you and your audience. I think any of that would be great discussion. So, why don't we go back to Josh? Or if whoever thinks what they want to answer first, just raise your hand because I don't want to put any pressure on anybody.
I'll go. I think for me, my favorite conversations, well, there's a couple different situations that I find really compelling and memorable. I'm not the only host of my show. So occasionally my friend and co-host Justin will do episodes that I have no idea he's doing. He's speaking to people, and then he'll just send me the file,
Yeah.
and he'll just be like, publish it, and I do. I mean, I don't listen to it first, because we're partners, and it's really fantastic just being surprised by someone else's questions and someone else's conversation. I like being surprised. Let's see what else. There are like through lines in over the course of the show that I think are interesting. There's like different conversational threads that kind of weave throughout um, many episodes. And there's that sort of it really feels to me like an ongoing conversation, an ongoing exploration, which I suppose makes some sense. It's being driven in large part by the questions I'm asking, the interest that I have.
Yeah.
But then there are occasionally conversations that we have with people where there's just like a little throw, and I'm sure this is like very normal of having conversations with anyone really, is somebody will just say something that it's almost like a throwaway line, but it
Mm-hmm.
sticks with you and
Mm-hmm.
it starts to work in your head. And there have been several moments like that that I wasn't necessarily expecting, and it's changed how I think about things, or how I approach things. So it's really been yeah, there's the surprise factor and there's the transformation factor. And I think those two things kind of go together for me.
Yeah. That's great. Thanks, Matt. Who wants to jump in next? Josh?
Yeah, I'll follow Matt since I like him. I mean, I kind of I like what Matt had to say, and I resonate with a lot of it. Well, I guess I'll try to answer both briefly. One of the things that has surprised me the most is just, and I guess maybe this will sound petty, but just the fact that people like actually listen and appreciate it, um, which has been really cool to see. And like, the I don't know. I feel like I'm constantly wrestling with some kind of imposter syndrome, or like, is this really worth all my time and energy and effort? And just like the DM that shows up on Instagram every once in a blue moon, right? I'm not getting hit up all the time. Uh that's just like, thank you so much for this episode. It really spoke to me. It helped me. That's always surprising and always just kind of gives me encouragement to keep going, I guess,
Yeah.
because podcasting is a lot of work, right? And for very little return. Um, but one of the guests that really, I think, has stuck with me, but mostly because they shifted my understanding of what I was doing on at Rethinking Faith.
Hmm.
Um, they I won't name them because I don't want to name drop, but they are a former pastor who's written many books, and they invited me. Like, I tried to outline the book that I was interviewing them about and ask them these like academic questions. And this person laughed at me and was like, "Josh, I don't even have an outline for that book. Like, you're missing the point." And they said, what I need you to do is ditch your outline and move out of your head, sink down into your heart, and we're going to feel our way through this conversation.
Wow.
And they said this line that has stuck with me ever since. There's an opportunity in life to invite others into your story, to be vulnerable enough to invite them into your story, to go deep enough into your own story that other people might find themselves there as well.
Mm.
And ever since that interview, my perspective on what I was doing at Rethinking Faith has shifted,
Wow.
because I noticed it's less about uh the academic ideas, although they're great. I love it. I live in my head. I read a bunch of nerd books that like nobody cares about, but I do. and but I love having these people on the show and asking them about their story, asking them about why they care about like macroevolution and divine contingency and blah 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 whatever, because that story is just so powerful. And so that maybe has been the biggest surprise.
Mm.
And at the same time, been the specific guest that really shifted things for me, that really changed me. Um, and hopefully I try to live into that in all that I do now. Just be vulnerable enough and be willing to go deep enough into my own story that other people find themselves there as well, so that they
Yeah.
know that they're not alone, so that I know that I'm not alone,
Yeah.
and that we're kind of all in this together. So that
Yeah.
that for me has been the biggest.
That was beautiful.
That's
Tony,
really
Tony
beautiful.
Tony cut in and he said he was going to out whoever it was. I guess it was Rob Bell. Is that correct?
I didn't say
Oh.
it, but if Tony said it,
Oh.
That does sound like a Rob Bell thing, actually.
Nice.
Nice.
Beautiful. Who else wants to comment on this area? Kate?
Well, first of all, it's so great to hear what you all have to say and to know that I'm not alone in this world of trying things. I think the biggest surprise for me in just doing all this is the room to experiment, to risk, and to keep going when many people around me are kind of raising an eyebrow and going, you know, I think maybe you're going a little too far, Kate. So and that what I'm finding is living on the edges of that is not easy, but
Mm-hmm.
there's a certain aspect of it that I think is necessary um, in order for new things to kind of be birthed, even if it's not my own, but it's coming through some of the stuff that we do. I mean, I think in the world of faith right now, and in the world in general, we just have to be willing, to try new things and to
Mm-hmm.
risk. Um, so, and then just some examples of that. When I did those recordings, I was trying to figure out how can we have some aspect of it that changes week to week. So we decided to have the homily or the message, be from somebody different in some cases each week. So we actually I asked the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, Michael Curry, and he's a very funny man,
Yeah.
as well as being quite a preacher. And he said yes. So I was just like, whoa. So he recorded his message in his office and sent it to us, and we dropped it in, and it just worked. And so that was kind of one of those things where
Mm-hmm.
I guess both asking him, to do that, like who does that? Who asked the presiding bishop to do this? And the fact that he said yes and he was willing. So I love living in this area of risk, experimenting and being with all of you because I know you're all doing that too. So.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just picking up this theme of vulnerability and at the edges and and mystery and being willing to go into places where vulnerability comes to the forefront and how that seems to be critical to these new explorations where people find this deeper place and this deeper meaning and what a gift that is, just as Josh talked about, what a gift it is to be willing to go there so that other people can go too and find themselves there. Yeah, nice. Anyone else want to comment before we go to some? Yeah, Robert.
I'll be brief so we can get to the Q&A, but Sherry, you wonderfully defined for us deconstruction, so now I'll drop the word again. We all have a working definition. I think one of the things that surprised me, and I don't mean this flippantly, is that classical theism can't be deconstructed enough. And I learned this pretty quickly from interviewing with Ilya in the beginning a couple of purely atheistic scientists who at least were self-proclaimed atheistic scientists, but as bright as they were, they didn't really seem to understand the philosophical definitions of atheism and agnosticism. Nevertheless, that wasn't what surprised me. What surprised me was even in the midst of those self-definitions, I learned that they were quickly willing to acknowledge that there's one reality, but multiple layers to that reality. And that they were more open to investigating God as process theism articulates God. There might be more of a renewal of belief. But they, unfortunately, many of them at least still seem to be working with a deistic conception of God, or a classical conception of God, let's just say, that doesn't jibe well with our new scientific cosmology or scientific story. So, yeah, I think that these conversations, in other words, can't happen enough, and they need to continue to go deeper and deeper. And I think that this could be a great moment for even more of those atheistic and agnostic scientists to maybe be illuminated and come on board with what's going on here. And there are many more. There are many more than we realize that I think would be open to this.
Yeah, that's neat. Yeah, years ago I started saying that when the scientists who talk about the the most macro level and the most micro level sound more and more like mystics every day.